The place stank like rot dressed in perfume, the kind of stink that made your stomach turn even as your eyes tried to pretend it wasn't there. The corridors of the meat market were narrow and slick underfoot, light bleeding from tubes overhead, buzzing like dying flies. Every surface seemed wet, as if the air itself was sweating out sickness. He walked slow, shoulders hunched, boots scraping through puddles that looked black under the neon glare. The sounds came in layers, low murmurs in strange tongues, the occasional metal clink of a cage door being slammed shut, and somewhere far ahead, the thin, desperate sound of someone crying. He kept his head down, but his eyes were cutting through the crowd, tracking the shadows between stalls. Bodies were everywhere. Not human bodies, too many ears, tails, eyes in the wrong places. The alien girls were displayed like exotic pets, chained in glass front cells, kneeling on cold metal floors. Their clothes were rags or strips of silk that didn't cover enough to keep out the cold, their skin patterned in colors that shimmered under the lights. Some watched him with dull, glassy eyes. Others stared at the floor as if it was safer not to be seen at all. The crowd was thick with bias-fat merchants in jeweled robes, insectoid shapes wrapped in mesh armor, scaled creatures clicking claws against datapads. Money and power hung in the air like heat. He didn't come here for trade. He came here because he'd heard the rumors, the ones whispered by drunks in back alleys and smugglers too scared to speak above a whisper. They said there was a shipment coming in tonight. Not livestock, not cargo, a collection. Girls unlike any the market had seen before, gorgeous, dangerous, rare beyond price. They said these girls were already half dead, stolen from ships, from cities, from beds, dragged across star systems to be paraded under the market's lights until some rich thing decided to buy them. They said once the sale was done, no one saw them again. He knew the kind of men who came for that. He'd killed some before. His coat was heavy with dust and rain, hiding the weapons tucked against his ribs. The knife was there for when he needed to be quiet. The gun was for when quiet was already gone. Beneath it all, his heartbeat was steady, a deep, slow drum in his chest. He wasn't here for mercy. He was here because this was the last mission, the last time he'd let himself step into this filth and pull someone out. He didn't want the job anymore. He didn't want the blood, but the girl's face in the stolen holler had burned into him. Pale lavender skin, ears tipped with soft fur, eyes too bright to belong in a place like this. She'd been chained, kneeling, tail wrapped tight round her legs, staring at the lens like she knew no one would ever come. And that was the moment he knew he'd go. The deeper he moved into the market, the more the air seemed to thicken, the way heat does before a storm. Stalls leaned over the walkway, their tarps dripping condensation. A seller hissed at him from behind a counter, voice thick and wet, offering deals on creatures that looked half dead, their beauty wilted by captivity. He kept moving, jaw locked. Somewhere above, a loudspeaker barked in a language he didn't know, the words cutting sharp and fast. The crowd shifted, a ripple moving through it like a current, and he knew without asking that the shipment had arrived. He felt it before he saw an unease crawling down his spine, an almost electric charge in the air. The crowd pressed tighter, greedy eyes turning toward the far platform. A heavy gate shuddered open, spilling out harsh white light. Shadows moved inside, small and hesitant, prodded forward by handlers in black armor. He could see tails flicking nervously, the twitch of delicate ears, the glimmer of terrified eyes catching the light. And then she stepped into view, the girl from the holler, exactly as he'd seen her. Except now her knees were trembling, her wrists red and raw from the cuffs, her gaze scanning the crowd as if searching for something she'd never find. And that was the moment the market vanished for him. The stink, the noise, the bodies all blurred away, leaving only her in the center of his sight. The last mission, the last rescue, the last time he'd put his life on the table for someone who might not even live to see tomorrow. He felt the weight of the gun under his coat, the knife at his side, and the familiar hollow calm settle in. His bones, one way or another, tonight the market would burn. He moved before the crowd fully swallowed her. Every second wasted here meant another hand could claim her, another set of chains could drag her away into some locked room where even his stubbornness couldn't reach. The market's floor was a shifting mess of slick metal panels, discarded, food wrappers, and leaking pipes overhead. He cut left into one of the feeder corridors, thin, crooked passageways meant for workers, smugglers, and the unlucky. It was darker here, the light struggling through warped plastic shields. The smell was worse, the stink of piss and engine coolant crawling into his lungs. He kept his breathing shallow and his eyes forward. A pair of reptilian guards lounged against a bulkhead, their scaled arms folded over heavy rifles. He didn't slow down, didn't give them reason to think he was more than another trader on his way to some backroom deal. One of them muttered something in a tongue full of hisses. He caught the tone dismissive, bored. Good, he passed them. Without looking back, the sound of a slow dripping pipe followed him like a ticking clock. His plan was already forming, not in neat lines, but in hard instinct. The girl was on the main platform now. That meant she'd be taken to the height pens before the auction. Those pens had to exits the front, where the buyers would gather, and the service corridors leading into the underbelly of the market. The underbelly was a labyrinth of storage rooms, power conduits, and maintenance bays, half of them abandoned, the rest crawling with the kind of staff who wouldn't care what was in a crate so long as the bribes were steady. He'd used it before. It was where the market's heart rotted in the dark. He reached a junction lit only by a single dying bulb. The hum of machinery was louder here, mixing with the muffled rumble of the auction hall. He slipped a hand under his coat and pulled a pistol compact, matte black, its grip worn smooth from years of use. One magazine. He'd make it enough. The knife stayed sheathed at his hip, waiting for the moments when noise wasn't an option. His boots were silent on the grated floor as he descended a narrow stairwell, the smell of oil and mold growing, heavier with each step. The underbelly greeted him with darkness, broken by thin slats of light spilling through vents. Pipes ran like veins along the ceiling, dripping condensation onto stacks of crates wrapped in tarps. The air was warmer here, almost feverish. The heat from the generators baking the smell of damp fabric and unwashed skin into the walls. Somewhere, in the distance, he heard a chain clink and a muffled whimper. His teeth clenched. He followed the sound, weaving between crates stacked higher than his head. Rats, real ones, not the cybernetic kind, skittered across the floor, their claws scratching on the metal. He reached a half-open door, the smell of blood faint but sharp on the other side. Inside, two handlers were sorting through a shipment of collars, their voices low. One of them laughed, the kind of laugh that carried cruelty in every note. His hand was on the knife before the thought even finished. The first went down with a blade across the throat, the sound wet and short. The second barely had time to turn before the knife buried itself under his jaw, silencing whatever curse was on his tongue. He eased them down to the floor, careful with the noise, then wiped the blade on the dead man's sleeve. The collars stayed on the table. He wasn't here to steal tools. He was here for her. A low alarm began to pulse somewhere. Overhead, not the panic klaxon, just the signal for a shipment transfer. That meant she'd be moving now, escorted to the pens. He stepped back into the corridor, scanning for movement, ears catching the faint sound of boots on metal far ahead. The handlers weren't taking her through the main floor. They were cutting through the service route. Bad luck for them. He slid along the wall until he reached a vent panel wide enough to crawl through. The screws were loose, probably pulled and replaced too many times to still bite clean. He yanked it free, the metal scraping faintly, then hauled himself into the duct. It was cramped, every movement echoing through the thin metal, but it gave him a view through the mesh down into the corridor below. Shadows moved, their 3 guards in black armor, rifles slung, walking slow. Between them, the girl from the hala, chains at her wrists, her bare feet silent on the floor, ears twitching. With every echo, her head was low, but he saw the flicker of her eyes scanning. Sharp even in fear, he tracked them through the ducts, the metal biting into his knees and palms. The heat up here was suffocating, sweat running down his neck. The guards turned into one of the final approach corridors, the one that fed into the pen block. If they reached the block, getting her out would mean fighting through half the market's hired guns. Not happening. He dropped from the vent. Before they reached the corner, hitting the floor hard enough to rattle his teeth. The pistol was already up when the first guard turned. The shot cracked loud in the narrow space, the man's visor shattering in a spray of black blood. The second went for his rifle, but the next bullet tore through his chest plate, folding him. The third got his gun halfway up before the knife found his throat, driving him against the wall in a silent choke. When the last body hit the floor, the girl was staring at him, breathing fast, her tail coiled tight around her legs. The cuffs at her wrists gleamed under the dim light. He holstered the pistol, stepped forward, and took the chain in both hands. "Not today," he muttered, and the steel gave way under the blade. The chain clattered to the floor, its echo running down the corridor like a warning bell. She didn't move at first, just rubbed her raw wrists, staring at him like she was trying to figure out if he was another nightmare in a different mask. He didn't have time to ease her into it. The market would feel those gunshots any second, and once it did, every exit would choke with bodies. He jerked his head down the corridor and started moving. Her bare feet whispered over the metal as she followed. Silent, but close. Good, at least she wasn't stupid. The air in the service corridor was thicker now, the hum of generators mixing with the slow pulse of the market's alert systems. The sound of buyers was a distant murmur, but the sharper noise, the one that meant trouble, was the metallic stomp of boots heading their way. He cut left into a maintenance shaft, the girl right on his heels. The narrow passage dropped them into a maze of stacked cargo containers, some open to show cages inside. Most of the cages were empty. The smell of old fur, dried blood, and unwashed. Bodies crawled up his throat. A faint flicker of neon spilled through a half-open hatch ahead. Beyond it lay one of the market's forgotten vein storage tunnels no one cared about unless they needed to hide something. The space beyond was a jungle of shadows and rust, chains swaying from the ceiling, puddles reflecting what little light dripped through. He could work with this. Shadows were his friend. Footsteps followed, closer now. Voices carried Dalian tongues, clipped and urgent. He flattened against the wall and pulled her in beside him. She tensed, ears twitching toward the noise, tail brushing his leg like an accidental confession. He kept a hand on her shoulder, the pressure just enough to keep her still. 2 guards passed the tunnel mouth, rifles raised. When they vanished into the dark ahead, he moved. They slipped into a side channel lined with heavy machinery. The hum of the power units masked their steps, but the heat rolling off them was suffocating. Sweat ran down his neck, soaking into his collar. The girl's breathing was light but steady, her gaze darting over every shadow like she expected it to bite. Smart instincts. He could use those. The exit he needed was closer maintenance lift that ran straight to the old docking ring. From there, they could slip onto the derelict upper decks and vanish into the station's skeleton. But the closer they got, the more the noise grew. A sharp clang of metal, the rasp of boots over grated floors. The lift wasn't unguarded. He eased forward until the lift came into view. 2 guards stood at its base, bored but armed, and worse. 3rd figure in long crimson robes, the kind that meant money and power in this place. The robed one wasn't here to ride the lift. He was here for her. Even from here, the angle of his head told the story. He was looking for something or someone that had just gone missing. The girl stiffened at the sight, her tail lashing. Once, slow. Her eyes had that edge now, the one that knew a personal monster when she saw it. He didn't ask. He'd seen it enough times before. SQs always came with ghosts. There was no path past them without a fight. He counted the seconds between the guard's idle glances, feeling the weight of the pistol at his side. Noise would bring more trouble, but hesitation would kill them both. He chose. The first shot took the guard on the left clean through the visor, his head snapping back as he crumpled. The second shot caught the other in the throat before he could raise his rifle. The robed one staggered back, shock breaking across whatever face hid under that hood. He turned to run, but the knife found his spine before he made 2 steps. The girl was watching, not flinching, as he yanked the blade free and let the body drop. The lift's controls were slick with dust, the panel flickering when he hit the call. The cage doors rattled open, revealing a space barely big enough for the 2 of them. She stepped inside without prompting, eyes still sharp, tail twitching like it couldn't decide between fear and fury. He followed, hitting the panel hard, enough to make it stick. As the lift shuddered into motion, the station's bones seemed to groan around them. From below came the echo of shouts, the sound of boots pounding toward the bodies they'd left behind. Above, the docking ring waited dark, cold, and half abandoned. He'd been there before, years ago, when the market still used it for overflow cargo. Now it was just another graveyard in the station's endless rust. The girl finally spoke, her voice low and raw. He didn't understand the words, but the way she said them was enough. She wasn't asking who he was. She was asking if they'd make it out alive. The lift rattled to a stop. He drew his pistol again. "We'll find out," he muttered, and the doors groaned open into the dark. The air that hit them was colder, sharper, carrying the sting of old metal and vacuum seals long past their prime. The docking ring stretched out in a hollow arc, its walls lined with dark, dust-caked windows that looked down into the endless black outside. Pale light from a dying star bled through cracks in the plating, spilling across rust and shadows. It was quiet here, the kind of quiet that felt watched. He stepped out first, boots crunching over debris scattered across the floor, bits of broken crates, twisted wiring, and scraps of fabric long forgotten. The girl stayed close, her bare feet making no sound, Her eyes swept the shadows like she could see things he couldn't, ears flicking at every groan from the metal above. She wasn't wrong to be jumpy. The market had hunters. Not just guards, but specialist strackers who didn't need to see you to find you. Somewhere far behind. A metallic thump echoed through the ring, too heavy to be settling plates. He knew the sound mag boots hitting the deck, moving in pairs. The market's private kill team had just stepped onto their trail. No wasted time, no casual sweep. These were men and things built for the sole purpose of bringing back stolen property, breathing or otherwise. The ring's layout came back to him in pieces: 3 main bulkheads, each with an emergency airlock. One had been sealed years ago. One opened into the civilian sector, but it was too far and too obvious. That left the last one old cargo venting dock, still tied into the maintenance grid. If the systems hadn't been gutted, he could force it open. He motioned for her to follow, cutting down a side corridor that ran like a scar along the ring's inner wall. The corridor's panels were warped and pitted, each step ringing. Faintly, he tried to keep the pace steady, but the cold knot in his gut tightened with every noise behind them. The hunters weren't hurrying. That was worse. They knew the exits. They knew the chase was already theirs. Halfway down, the smell changed. Less metal, more chemical faint, sweet rot that didn't belong here. The girl's ears went flat. He didn't have time to ask before a shadow peeled itself from the wall ahead. The thing was tall, wrapped in matte armor that drank the light. Its face was a visor of black glass, its arms long, ending in curved, hooked claws. It didn't move like a man. It flowed forward, silent, steps too smooth for something with weight. A hunter, not the kind you bribed, not the kind you could talk to. This one wouldn't bring her back breathing if it didn't have to. He raised the pistol, but the hunter was faster. The first swipe came in low, a blur of claws scraping sparks off the wall. He threw himself sideways, firing once, twice, both rounds punching into armor without slowing it down. The girl pressed back against the wall, her tail snapping tight around her legs. The third shot found something softer, an exposed joint at the hunter's side. Black ichor sprayed across the deck, and it hissed, a sound like steam escaping a pipe. It lunged, claws raking the air where his head had been a second earlier. The pistol was empty. He dropped it and drew the knife, closing the gap before it could reset. Up close, the hunter smelled like scorched wires and rotting meat. The blade went in deep under its arm, twisting until he felt something give. It staggered, claws scraping the wall in a screech that set his teeth on edge, then crumpled in a heap that twitched twice before going still. Silence returned, but not the safe kind. He knew what came next, the others. Hunters didn't work. Alone, he grabbed the girl's arm, not gentle, and pulled her into motion. She didn't resist, though her eyes stayed locked on the twitching corpse until it vanished behind the curve of the corridor. They reached the cargo, venting dock just as the first faint metallic thuds echoed again, closer now, boots hitting the deck in perfect rhythm. The control panel for the dock was a mess of exposed wires and cracked casing. He dropped to one knee, fingers digging into the guts of the system. The girl crouched beside him, watching his hands, ears twitching at every echo in the ring. The panel sparked once, then twice. Somewhere deep in the mechanism, gears shuddered. The airlock doors gave a low groan but didn't move. He slammed a fist into the side of the panel, felt something click, and the inner seal finally began to retract. The cold hit them instantly. pouring in from the void beyond the transparent outer doors. A shadow moved at the far end of the corridor. Then another, 2 hunters this time, moving in a slow, steady advance. The outer seal was still locked. He rose, knife in one hand, eyes on the hunters closing in. The girl stepped back toward the door, tail coiled, gaze fixed on him like the cold hit like a living thing, wrapping around his face, biting through the coat and sinking straight to the bone. The half-open seals poured in the vacuum's breath, sharp and dry, making every inhale feel like glass in his lungs. The hunters didn't care. They came in low and fast, armor drinking the dying light, claws slicing through the air with a sound that cut deeper than metal. He didn't wait for them to close the gap. He moved first, the knife a flash in his hand, stepping into the space the first hunter thought it owned. The blade slid between plates, up under the arm, twisting hard. The thing buckled, a hiss spilling from the black glass of its visor, but its momentum carried it into him. They slammed against the wall hard enough to shake the paneling, his shoulders screaming from the impact. The second hunter didn't slow. It came in from the side, claws reaching for his ribs. He shoved the first one into its path, felt the wet crack as armored claws punched through its partner's back. Ichor sprayed the wall in black arcs. He kicked the dying one away, but the survivor was already tearing free, claws dripping with whatever passed for blood here. The airlock groaned again, metal screaming under the strain. The seal was still only 3/4 open. The cold howled, louder now, pulling at his coat, tugging hair across his face. His breaths came in hard, white clouds. The girl was still behind him, her tail wound so tight it looked ready to snap, eyes locked on the hunter like she was memorizing every move it made. The thing lunged. He dropped low, letting its claws tear open the air where his head had been, then drove the knife upward in a brutal arc. The blade scraped armor, bit into soft tissue at the joint of its thigh, and tore through with a ripping sound. The hunter stumbled, one leg refusing to hold weight, but it still swung fast, wild. A claw caught his arm, the slice burning hot before the cold swallowed the pain. The girl moved, no hesitation. No wasted motion, she darted forward, her chains still clinking faintly at her wrists, and slammed into the hunter's side. It wasn't strength that did it was precision. Her foot came down hard on the joint where the plating met the visor's edge, and the crack of glass was almost lost under the airlock's wail. The hunter reeled, hands clawing at its own face, the black visor spiderwebbed and leaking ichor. He didn't waste the opening. The knife went in under the chin, straight through whatever counted as its brain, and came out wet and steaming in the freezing air. The body hit the deck and didn't move again. For a second, there was only the cold and the pounding of his heart. Then the airlock's inner seals banged fully open. Beyond the transparent outer doors was a loading bioskeletal dock framed in rust, with a line of dark cargo skiffs hovering silent in the vacuum. No lights, no crew, just a graveyard waiting for thieves. He stepped inside, pulling her with him before the market's kill team could find another way in. The cold here was absolute, bleeding into his teeth, biting at his eyes. Every step felt heavier, every movement dragging against the low gravity. The girl's breaths came fast, her chest rising and falling under the tatters of silk, eyes wide, but unblinking. They reached the nearest skiffer, small boxy hauler with a cockpit just big enough for 2, if they didn't care about comfort. The access panel was dead, no power to the controls. He dropped to one knee, fingers numb as he pulled at the wiring. Somewhere far behind, deep in the docking ring, the thud of boots echoed again. Slow, patient. The market wasn't done hunting. The skiff's panel was a mess of corroded wires and cracked insulation, brittle from years of neglect. His fingers barely felt what they touched. The cold had chewed through skin and bone until his hands felt like they belonged to someone else. The girl crouched beside him, her breath a sharp rhythm in the freezing air, her ears twitching toward every echo from the docking ring. The boots were closer now, still slow, still steady. The kind of slow that said, "We already have you boxed in." A flicker, a spark. The panel coughed weakly, then lit with a sickly green glow. He jammed 2 wires together, felt the bite of current, snapped through his fingers, and the skiff's systems groaned awake. The cockpit glass lit faintly, showing the thin frost clinging to the edges. Somewhere inside the hull, fuel pumps stuttered to life. It wasn't much, but it would move. Inside, he snapped, pushing her toward the cockpit. She slid in without a word, curling into the co-pilot's seat, her tail wrapped tight around her knees. He climbed in after her, sealing the hatch with a heavy clang. The air in here was stale, thick with the smell of dust and old coolant, but it was warmer than the dock. His breath fogged less. The main console stuttered, warning lights flashing like it was screaming at him not to fly. He ignored them all, fingers dancing over the manual thruster controls. The skiff shuddered, breaking free from the frozen docking clamps with a metallic scream that felt far too loud. Outside, the docking bay began to shrink as the skiff drifted. Free. That's when the hunters changed tactics. Through the frost-streaked cockpit glass, he saw movement, a sleek, black shape slipping free of a neighboring dock. Then another, market interceptors, fast, angular, built for one thing, running down prey. Their hulls shimmered under the dying star's light. No markings, no wasted angles. The kind of ships that could turn a skiff into vapor before the pilot even saw the shot. He slammed the throttle forward. The skiff bucked like it was trying to tear itself apart, then surged toward the broken mouth of the docking ring. The girl gripped the armrest, her claws digging in, ears flat against her head. The interceptors moved like predators in water, sliding into position on either flank. The debris field was a header, halo of twisted metal and shattered hulls orbiting the station like a crown of bones. It was suicide to fly through without nav assistance. He aimed straight for it. The first shots came from the left interceptor, thin lances of blue light that tore through the black, searing past the skiff's hull close enough to make the plating hum. He jerked the controls hard, the skiff rolling onto its side, scraping along a drifting chunk of station debris that spun lazily through space. The second interceptor swung wide, trying to cut them off. The skiff screamed as he pushed it. Harder, the engines coughing, threatening to stall. The debris field swallowed them, shadows and broken structures blotting out the star's light. Inside, everything became a shifting maze of metal ribs, dangling cables, and jagged plates spinning slowly through the void. Perfect for losing pursuers. Perfect for dying in a collision. The interceptors followed anyway, their engines burning cold and bright. He threaded the skiff between the skeletal remains of an old hauler, the gap so tight that the hull scraped sparks from both sides. The girl's breath caught, but she didn't make a sound. One interceptor clipped a piece of spinning debris, shield flaring, hull twisting. It dropped back, but the other was still closing, its nose lights cutting across the skiff's tail like a predator's gaze. A warning shriek lit the console target lock. He slammed the skiff into a roll just as the first missile streaked past, spiraling into the wreckage ahead in a silent explosion that turned the void into a brief, terrible light show. Through the chaos, he spotted a narrow tunnel between two wrecks, half collapsed, barely wide enough for the skiff. He didn't think, he aimed for it. The girl's hand closed around the seat's frame, claws biting into the worn leather as the skiff dove into the black slit. Behind them, the interceptor hesitated, just for a second. That was all it took. The tunnel swallowed the skiff whole, the world outside vanishing into darkness. The tunnel closed around them like the throat of some dead beast, swallowing every scrap of light until the cockpit became a coffin lit only by the trembling glow of the console. The metal here was old, warped by heat and cold, ribs of broken, bulkheads curving overhead in jagged arcs. Every movement of the skiff set echoes rolling through the hollow groan here. A dull metallic clunk there that made it sound like the wreck itself was breathing. He eased the throttle back, letting the ship drift more than fly. The nav systems blinked uselessly, the sensors confused by the density of debris. Out here, every scrap of guidance was in his head, stitched together from instinct and experience. He could almost feel the metal around them, the way it shifted. In the cold, the way certain shadows were deeper than others. The girl was silent, watching him with wide, unblinking eyes. Her ears twitched at each groan from the hull, each faint ping of something bumping against the skiff outside. Her tails were still tight around her legs, but there was something else in her gaze, now an alertness that wasn't just fear. She was listening to more than sound. Then he heard it too, not the distant hum of the interceptor. Engines they'd been lost somewhere in the maze. Not the faint static of the coms, dead and useless. This was closer, softer, a scraping like metal sliding on metal just outside the hull, keeping pace with them. He slowed the skiff even more, letting it glide through the black. The scraping shifted, circling the ship, and he caught the flicker of movement outside a pale shape, long and thin, darting between the wreck's broken ribs. For a moment he thought it was a stray cable drifting in the vacuum, but cables didn't move like that. They didn't watch. Another shape slid into view on the opposite side, then another, thin, pale, almost translucent in the dim light, like stretched skin over a skeleton. He counted 4 before they vanished into the black again. The girl's claws dug into the armrest, her ears flat against her skull. She whispered something short, sharp, the kind of word that carried weight even without translation. The scraping came again, this time above. A thump followed it, faint but heavy, landing right on the hull. He reached for the throttle, ready to punch them out of here, but a sudden flare of movement in front made him freeze. The wreck's corridor narrowed into a jagged choke point ahead, just barely wide enough for the skiff. Hanging in the gap was one of the pale things, its long limbs wrapped around the metal, head tilted in a way that made his skin crawl. Its eyes, if they were eyes, were pits of reflected starlight, empty but fixed on the cockpit. The girl hissed. Low, a sound like tearing silk. The thing moved faster than anything that size should. It lunged, arms spreading wide, claws scraping sparks across the hull as it latched on. The whole skiff shuddered under the impact. Somewhere above, more thumps landed, 2, 3, maybe more. The scraping became a frenzy, claws digging for purchase. He slammed the throttle forward. The skiff screamed through the choke point, the thing clinging to the front window, smearing the glass with something thick and dark. The metal ribs of the wreck blurred past, close enough to touch. One strike from turning them into shrapnel. A sharp bang rattled the hole one of the things had torn free, spinning away into the black. Another slid across the canopy, its limbs splayed like a broken insect, before vanishing into the void. The girl had one hand braced on the dashboard now, the other pressed against the seat. Her body tensed like she was ready to leap at the glass. The scraping slowed, the shapes retreating into the shadows, until there was only the sound of the skiff's engines and the groan of metal behind them. He didn't slow, not until the tunnel opened up into a wider cavity, the void spilling in through jagged rents in the wreck. Somewhere behind them, in the black throat they'd left, something let out a sound, low, long, and hollow. A sound that didn't come from anything human. The corridor beyond the auction room was colder, darker, a place where the light struggled to keep up with the stench. Shadows clung to the walls, whispering of all the lives dragged through here before being stripped, packaged, and sold. The human's boots made no sound, his presence a ghost slipping between cracks in the meat market's machinery. The girls followed, some limping, some carried, their tails curling tightly around themselves, as if their own bodies were the last scraps of safety they could hold on to. The air tasted like rust and ammonia, every breath cutting deeper into his lungs. He ignored the way the steel walls sweated with condensation, how the pipes above leaked, drumming a hollow rhythm that felt like the pulse of something ancient and predatory. Ahead, a door pulsed with red light, an emergency seal, and beyond it, the docking bay. His ship was there, he prayed, untouched, unscanned. But the alarms had shifted, their pitch warping into a hunt tone that meant someone had noticed too many bodies were missing. The sound was a net tightening around his mind. He shoved the panel open, muscles screaming, and the blast of cold hit like a weapon. Beyond the threshold, the bay was not empty. Silhouettes moved along, insectoid guards in refractive armor, their heads clicking toward him. The girls froze, claws trembling in instinctive terror. He stepped forward alone, hand tightening round the weapon at his side. But inside his chest, his heart felt like it was trying to chew through bone. He had no more time for planning, no more shadows to hide in. Either they walked through here, alive, or they didn't walk at all. The insectoid guards fanned out in a semicircle, their bodies refracting the dim light into jagged splinters that stabbed at his eyes. Each one moved with that unnerving, predator-perfect stillness until it chose to strike, their limbs flexing in slow, deliberate clicks like the winding of a clock that could explode into violence at any second. He could hear the alien girls, breathing behind him, shallow and rapid, their fear vibrating in the air like static. The cold from the docking bay seeped into his bones, but it was the silence that made his skin crawl, the kind of silence that carried intent, not peace. His weapon felt heavy in his hand, heavier than it ever had, the grip slick from sweat he refused to acknowledge. One guard took a step forward, its translucent carapace shimmering with oily colors, its mandibles flexing in what could have been hunger or curiosity. He adjusted his stance without thinking, centering himself between the creatures and the girls. His mind was already calculating angles, distances, escape probabilities, and every number came back bad. The alarms screamed from deep within the market, echoing down the steel corridors like the building itself was warning the predators to close in. The girls pressed tighter together, tails wrapping around arms, ears flattened against their skulls. He breathed once, deep and slow, then moved. A single shot cracked through the bay, bright as lightning in the dim cold, punching straight through the nearest guard's head. The body collapsed without a sound, the shimmering shell dulling instantly as it hit the floor. That broke the stillness. The others lunged, and the bay erupted into chaos, claws scraping steel, mandibles clashing, the air filled with the stench of scorched chitin. He fought like a man who had burned the map back home, like a man with no retreat left in him. The girls screamed, not in panic now, but in the sharp, raw sound of survival. Blood, alien and human, smeared across the deck as his boots skidded for purchase. Another guard went down, its segmented limbs twitching in broken rhythm. He could feel a deep, hot ache building in his shoulder where one of them had slashed through armor, but pain was a distant, useless thing. He needed space, needed to move. Them toward the ship, his ship, black and low in the far corner of the bay like a shadow daring the light to find it. Every heartbeat was a countdown, and then, in the periphery, movement not from the guards, but from above. Something heavy dropped from the scaffolding with a metallic shriek, slamming into the floor between him and the girls. Not another. Guard, worse. It hit the floor with a weight that made the steel groan, rising in a slow, deliberate motion that somehow seemed more threatening than a charge. Its frame was humanoid, but far too tall, far too wrong, an armored exosuit of jagged black alloy, plates overlapping like predatory scales. No skin, no fur, no hint of what lived inside, only a single vertical slit in the helm, glowing faintly with a deep, blood-warm crimson. The air around it felt heavier, like the thing dragged gravity with it. And the girls froze, tails curling so tightly they looked ready to snap. It moved one hand long, segmented fingers curling, and the guards halted instantly, clicking. In sharp, synchronized submission, the figure's head tilted toward him, that single red slit locking on like a targeting array. He had no idea what species this was, but every instinct screamed that this was the kind of enemy you didn't kill by accident, the kind that collected debts in pain, not money. The alarms above seemed muted now, almost irrelevant, as if the market itself was holding its breath for the next sound this thing would make. The voice came low and resonant, the kind that felt like it was inside your chest rather than your ears. Words in an alien tongue, thick and wet with consonants that clicked against each other like teeth. He didn't understand the language, but he didn't need to. The tone said everything. A warning, a claim, a promise of what would happen if he took another step. The crimson slit widened just slightly, brightening as if it were tasting the air between them, and the whip in its hand hummed with a low, vibrating threat. He felt it in his teeth more than his ears. The guards around it clicked their mandibles. In unison, the sound bouncing off the metal walls like the chamber was narrowing, sealing him in. Somewhere high above, an announcement blared in a distorted alien tongue, probably calling more enforcers, but down here the noise didn't matter. He adjusted his stance, spreading his weight over both feet, one hand on the rifle, the other hovering near the knife strapped to his thigh. The alien girls behind him didn't make a sound, but he could feel them press tight against his back, breaths shallow and rapid, the tremor in their touch making him want to tear through the entire market with his bare hands. That wasn't strategy, that was instinct. The figure stopped just out of reach, the metal coils of its whip uncoiling with slow, deliberate menace. One of the guards hissed and shifted forward to eager, and the figure's head turned, slow and predatory, freezing the guard mid-step. Even its own subordinates were terrified of it. Good, that was something he could use. He didn't lower his voice when he spoke. If you want them. He shifted slightly so the rifle came up, the barrel steady between them. You'll have to step over me. It wasn't bravado, it was a dare. And from the way the figure tilted its head, it understood. The whip lashed. He sidestepped, dragging the nearest girl with him, the coil snapping past so close it shaved a line of sparks. From the wall, he fired, not at the figure, but at the control panel behind it. The burst ripping through circuitry and detonating in a shower of light. The steel door beside them slammed down halfway before freezing. Hydraulics screaming under the sudden lock. The figure's slit flared bright red. A low rumble echoing from within its armor. Maybe a curse, maybe a laugh. The guards broke formation, hissing and skittering toward him in a synchronized rush. Claws out. He grabbed the smallest girl, shoved her under the half-lowered door, then kicked another forward after her. Run, he barked, even though he knew they didn't understand the word. They understood him. 2 guards lunged. He ducked, slammed his knife up through the chin of the first, and spun with the falling body, using its momentum to drive the second into the wall. The whip cracked again, this time aimed for his knees, but he vaulted over it, shoulder rolling as his boots hit the slick floor. His rifle barked twice, and one of the guards crumpled in a spray of dark ICHOR. The girls were through, scrambling into the shadows beyond the half-lowered door. That was the opening. He just had to make it himself, and keep the monster in armor from following. The moment the last of the girls slipped under the steel door, he lunged forward, catching the edge of the panel with his fingertips. The hydraulics fought him, a steady mechanical whine straining against his pull, but he put every ounce of strength into it. Metal groaned, the weight grinding into his shoulders, but the gap narrowed, closing like the jaws of some enormous predator. On the other side, the smallest girl's glowing eyes flickered in the dim light. She hesitated, as if she wanted to come back for him, but one of the others yanked her deeper into the shadows. Smart, stay gone. A blur of movement, the whip lashed out again, the coils snapping around his forearm. Pain flared white-hot, the impact rattling every bone in his arm. The armored figure yanked, trying to drag him back into the kill zone. He let the pull happen for half a step, then slammed the butt of his rifle into the cable's taut length. Sparks leaped, and the weapon screamed in a static burst before the whip retracted. Not today, he muttered, voice low and lethal. The figure advanced now. No more tests or feints. It came at him in a glide, like a hunting shark cutting through water. Its slit was burning molten red, brighter than before. He could feel an aura of heat, like stepping too close to a forge. Each step it took seemed to pull the shadows toward it, warping the light. The last 2 guards lunged together. He dropped, one with a round to the sternum, then rolled sideways, catching the second in the ribs with his knife. No time for finesse. He just pushed until the creature went slack. The armored figure was almost on him. The sound of its movement wasn't footsteps, it was breathing, deep and mechanical, pumping through the vents in its suit. The whip flared again, twin coils now sparking like liquid lightning in its hands. He dove for the door's edge, slammed the emergency override on his wrist console, and the panel dropped. Not fast enough to take the figure's head off, but fast enough to cut the whips in half. The sudden metal screech rang like a bell. The severed coils fell, sizzling. Between them, the figure froze on the other side, red slit narrowing to a pinpoint. He didn't know if it was rage or respect, but he felt the weight of that stare even as the door sealed completely with a final echoing clamp. For a moment, there was only silence, broken by the sound of his own breathing. Then boom, the Door dented inward, hard enough to rattle the bolts. Again and again, whatever that thing was, it wasn't done. He turned and ran into the shadows where the girls had gone. He'd bought time. Nothing more. The tunnels were barely wide enough for him to run at full stride, their walls slick with condensation dripping from ancient coolant pipes overhead. The air down here smelled of rust and salt, like a drowned ship that had never quite given up. Somewhere ahead, the alien girls padded barefoot, their faint bioluminescent patterns flickering in the dark like fireflies trying to outrun a storm. The smallest one glanced back once, her luminous feline eyes catching the dim, green emergency light. She wasn't just scared, she was listening, ears twitching, tail coiling tightly around her thigh as if to make herself smaller. He slowed, listening to dot thunk. Far behind, the sound came again, slow, deliberate. It wasn't footsteps, it was heavier, like metal plates being lowered onto the floor and then dragged forward. The armored figure hadn't stopped. It had found another way in. Move, he whispered, shoving the group ahead. They didn't need the translation. Fear made its own language. They weaved through a maze of pipes and grated walkways, passing under flickering warning signs in scripts he couldn't read. Water dripped from somewhere far above, the droplets ringing in the hollow dark. Every sound made him look over his shoulder. Thunk. Closer now, they passed a rusted bulkhead door, half-open edges warped. He slipped inside with the girls, forcing the warped frame wider until it screamed against the metal. Inside was a low chamber filled with thick steam. Heat rolled off the pipes, making his skin slick instantly. It was harder to hear in here. The hiss of pressure valves drowned out everything. That was the point. He motioned for them to stay low behind a massive coolant tank, then crouched at the only entrance. The steam was so thick that shapes were little more than ghosts drifting through a white fog. His rifle felt heavier in his hands, sweat stinging his eyes. A shape appeared in the mist, tall, jagged, wrong. The red slit of its visor burned through the vapor like an ember in smoke. He didn't fire, not yet. He needed it closer. The figure stepped forward, silent this time. No whips now. It held something else. A blade. A long curved length of dark alloy that seemed to swallow the light around it. His breathing slowed. Every muscle locked, ready, another step. Another dot he moved. The rifle came up in one smooth motion, and he fired, not at the head, but at the overhead pipe above it. The round punched through metal, and scalding steam erupted downward in a white flood. The figure staggered, just enough for him to unload the rest of his magazine into its torso. Sparks burst from its armor, pieces shattering into the fog. It didn't fall. It just turned its head toward him, slow and deliberate. Another strike overhead, this time. He rolled aside, the blade biting into the steel deck where he'd been. Steam shot up in a screaming burst, clouding the space even thicker. They circled each other now, shadows, moving in a white storm. He could barely breathe, barely see. But sound still told the story, the faint whine of its servos tightening for a swing, the drip of condensation off the tank behind him, the quick, shallow breaths of someone terrified, not his own. Then he heard it, just barely, the soft scuff of a bare foot against the floor from the far side of the room. One of the girls was moving. No, too late. The figure turned sharply, the glowing slit of its visor locking onto movement in the mist. It stepped toward her. He moved without thinking. No time for stealth, only speed. His boots thundered. On the steel deck, each step a challenge, each step buying her a second. He slammed into the figure from behind with all his weight. The impact jarred his teeth, the armor like hitting a wall, but it staggered. The blade went wide. They crashed into a bank of pipes. The figure swung an elbow back, catching him across the jaw. Stars burst in his vision. He didn't let go. He drove the knife again and again into the same joint at its side, not to pierce, but to break, to jam, to make it stop moving like a ghost. Something gave with a metallic snap. The figure lurched, but it wasn't finished. It reached back, grabbed him by the chest rig, and threw him across the room.